Here we go, friends. The 5 main consistencies that I work with. First up, we have the stiff peak piping consistency. Next up is the medium peak piping. And then we have the soft peak piping consistency. Look at that shine. Then for floods, I work with a thick flood, blump, blump, and then a thin flood. So what do you think, folks? Do you want to see each of these consistencies broken out one by one? Also, real talk, folks, I actually work with 7, but I just call the other 2 like bonus consistencies. So let's get started walking through each of these consistencies one by one from thickest to thinnest. The thickest consistency I use is called a stiff peak piping consistency. I rarely ever use this because it's very thick and so it's very hard to pipe and it's hard on the hands. I will only use this for florals, which I rarely ever do. The way you test this here is you test the peak. You want the peak to stand upright. There's a lot of texture. It's very stiff, but it is still fluffy. The next thickest consistency I work with is called a medium peak piping consistency. This I will use for piping detail that needs to hold its shape, but not so stiffly as, say, a floral, which needs a stiff peak. I use this for things like piping crust on a pie, pressure piped detailing like scales on a fish or mermaid tail, or sweater knit or cables. 9 times out of 10, I'm going to pick a medium peak over a stiff peak. I only use a stiff peak when absolutely necessary. The way that you test for a medium peak is you're looking for the peak of the icing to just fall over but not collapse. You want the icing to be glossy but still very much hold its shape. It will have just a little bit of texture to it. You can test for the peaks both by dabbing your spoon or spatula in the bowl, as you've seen me do here, as well as pulling the spoon or spatula out of the bowl and holding it upright. Overall, while I prefer a medium peak to a stiff peak, I prefer using a soft peak piping consistency even more because I find it to be the most versatile and the most forgiving, which, don't you worry, I will show you next. This is a soft peak piping consistency. It's my absolute favorite because it is the most versatile, but it's the hardest to make. It's the most versatile because it is both thick enough that it can hold its shape and function as a piping consistency, but it is thin enough that it can settle flat and smooth with assistance, almost like a flood. It is the hardest to make because there is a very small window where the icing is just thick enough and just thin enough. You're looking for peaks that have collapsed, but the icing still holds its shape. It's very glossy and smooth. Some describe it as warm toothpaste. There are many different ways that I test to make sure I've gotten it right. You first saw me check the peaks. What I'm doing now is called the blob test. I want a spoonful of icing to fall off the spoon in about 10 to 15 seconds. If it doesn't fall off, it's too thick, or if it falls off right away, it's too thin. Next, I want to see that the icing can settle smooth with assistance. I'm just using the spatula to jiggle the surface of the icing right now. And then the last test that I like to do is to place small dabs of icing on the surface. This shows me that while it can settle with assistance, it can also maintain integrity between different layers of icing. For lettering, for example, you want to know that the crossovers will stay distinct. I use what I consider extra thick and thick floods for a 1 consistency outline and flood. This first one here is my extra thick flood and is what I call a bonus consistency because it's just a slight variation on my thick flood and I only use it on minis. My extra thick flood very easily blobs off the spoon and requires a lot of assistance to settle. Then up next is my thick flood. This is what I use to outline and flood standard size cookies. For me, a thick flood just barely trickles off the spoon in a consistent stream and will need assistance to settle smooth and flat. These days, this is my flood consistency of choice and is what you'll see me use most often because I think it's just faster and easier to apply. However, it does need assistance settling. I no longer use the seconds method as I prefer to measure it by how the icing falls off the spoon or spatula. Here, I just wanted to show you how the icing will start to settle on its own, but it does need the slight jiggle of the bowl to completely settle smooth and flat. And look at this. I use what I consider thin and extra thin floods for a 2 consistency outline and flood. This first one is a thin flood and is what I would most commonly use for a 2 consistency outline and flood. For me, it's thin enough when it has just reached the point of streaming consistently and quickly off the spoon, and it will settle on its own. Now, let's not talk about the fact that I didn't leave the camera going long enough for this to actually settle, but I promise that it does on its own. I also just want to say that these are what I consider my thin floods. To another cookier, my thin or even extra thin flood might just be a standard flood for them. I just personally prefer to work with thicker floods. Next up is an extra thin flood, which I consider to be a bonus consistency because it's a slight variation on a thin flood. It will stream off the spoon even faster and will settle even faster than a thin flood. This I use when doing a design with a lot of wet on wet because I'll have more time to work with it before it dries. The thinner the consistency, the longer it takes to dry. Here are some examples of all of the 5 main consistencies that I use in my decorating from thickest to thinnest. First up is the stiff peak piping consistency. Here are some examples of me using stiff peak piping consistency, and I gotta admit here, I had to dig deep into my archives to find these because I so rarely ever use stiff peak piping consistency. It is the thickest consistency to work with. It's very hard on the hand because it's so stiff, and squeezing that piping bag with your hand after a while gets you hand cramps. It's the kind of consistency you want to use when you want something to really hold its shape. Most people use it for florals. I don't do much of any florals, so I guess I mostly just use it for whipped cream and Christmas trees, so it seems. But it's still very useful to have. Next up is medium peak. Here are a bunch of different examples of me using a medium peak piping consistency. There are a lot, so I sped them up so I could fit as many as I could into 1 minute. If you caught my set celebrating Black women, I used a medium peak for a lot of the different hairstyles because I wanted there to be a clear definition between the locks, the braids, the twists, very clear difference between the different textures and different hairstyles. Another very common use for me is crusts on pies. Lots of different ways to do crusts. Another favorite is this sweater piping. This is a type of pressure piping, this sweater technique. I love this one. And here is challah from the Rosh Hashanah set that I made. Here is some frosting on a whisk and the bubbles in a cauldron. Spooky, eh? And this is another common technique that I do with an offset spatula or a kitchen knife. And something else that I do quite often is this painted technique. I use a medium peak because I really want there to be texture and definition in the icing. And there we go, a bunch of different examples of medium peak piping consistency. Next up is soft peak piping. And here are some examples of soft peak piping consistency. First and foremost, this is my lettering consistency. People ask me all the time, what consistency do you use to letter? And this is it, folks, a soft peak. It is great for this kind of pressure piped lettering with varying thicknesses of the letter, and also great for just a single thickness lettering as well, just like this cursive here. But I do use it for a lot of other things, like hair, for example, and a lot of line work, a lot of different kinds of line work. The soft peak just lays the best down when you're doing line work. You get the smoothest lines. Chef's kiss. The next way I use a soft peak, though, is probably less common, but absolutely my favorite. Royal icing is known to crater, especially in small spaces. The thicker the icing, though, the less likely it is to crater. So I like to use a soft peak in these small spaces because it's the thickest consistency you can use where it can still settle. And this, friends, this is why I love a soft peak piping. Let's talk about how I use my extra thick and thick floods. I use an extra thick flood for minis. I consider it a bonus consistency since it's a slight variation on the thick flood and I don't use it very often. I use the thickest consistency possible in any application for more poof and faster drying, hence an extra thick flood for minis. Now, while it's easier to do wet on wet in a thinner flood, I actually do wet on wet in all floods. It just requires a lot more scribe action in the thicker floods. Next up is my thick flood, which I use to flood standard size cookies in a 1 consistency outline and flood. This flood is thick enough that it doesn't need a piping consistency outline to hold it in, but it is thin enough that it can settle flat pretty easily. My trademark cue that I've used a thick flood is when I use a scribe to jiggle the cookie to settle the icing. These days, this is my flood consistency of choice and is what I use most often because for me, it's faster and easier to apply. I also do a lot of wet on wet with a thick flood. I just have to use a scribe to help the wet on wet settle since by the time I finish the design, the icing has already started to crust. I even use a thick flood on minis and love doing a little wet on wet thick flood mini. Let's talk about how I use my thin and extra thin flood consistencies. First up is my thin flood. This is what I use when I do a 2 consistency outline and flood, and to be honest, I don't use it much these days. I did a lot at the beginning of my cookie career, but not so much anymore as I just prefer the ease of using a thick flood for a 1 consistency outline and flood. Whether you use a 1 or 2 consistency outline and flood is totally personal preference. I do love using a thin flood though when doing wet on wet, and I even use a thin flood as a 1 consistency outline and flood sometimes when I'm feeling real feisty. Next up is my extra thin flood. To me, this is a bonus consistency as it's just a slight variation on my thin flood. I use this when doing a lot of wet on wet because the thinner the flood, the more time you have to work with it before it crusts. You also have the added benefit of the piping outline as a fence to keep the icing from overflowing. All that said, all of these examples are very old as I almost never use an extra thin flood these days. I even sometimes play with fire and actually do a 1 consistency outline and flood with an extra thin flood. Or maybe this is a thin flood, I don't know, it is just thin.